strike the right balance.
I'm gonna have to start it over again. I had an interruption here. Okay, to the editor, just a note, strike that. We're going to start over again here. My guest today is Welshman Rory Cellan-Jones. He is the BBC's technology correspondent. From the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s to the rise of Google and Facebook to the iPad, he's covered all the gadget and business stories. He's been described as the non-geek's geek and aims to look at the impact of the internet and digital technology on our lives and businesses. Rory, welcome to the Earned Media Podcast.
Very excited to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Now, Rory, the closest thing we have to the BBC is PBS, but the BBC is a little different, right?
The BBC is all-consuming in the UK. To some people, it's too powerful, but it is part of the fabric of the nation. It's about to celebrate its centenary in a year or so's time. It is radio, it is television, it's got a big online operation, it's got regional stations, and it is, as I say, built into the fabric of British society. It's still controversial. Politicians from both sides will tell you it's biased. It has a mission to be impartial, and it's got a unique funding model, or one which will seem unusual to Americans. We're supported by a license fee. Anyone who watches TV in the UK has to buy a license, which costs at the moment, it's something like $200 a year. And that supports the BBC, and that gives us an annual income of something like $5 or $6 billion. And that system has survived longer than lots of people thought it might. It's always under pressure. There's lots of people who think it's a bad idea, but it generally, and until now, it's maintained the support of the public and at least a majority of the politicians.
But now you guys don't have ads on BBC in the UK, right? We just have ads on the BBC in America.
We do have a commercial operation that runs outside the UK, BBC World TV, which has got a pretty decent audience in various places around the world, and that is supported by advertising. Similarly, we have our online operation, bbc.com. You can read stuff I write, my colleagues write, and you will see adverts next to it if you are outside the UK. So yeah, there is some income from that, and obviously there's always pressure to increase that income.
And who's in charge? Is it a political appointee? Who runs the BBC, and who decides who runs the BBC?
Well, right at the top, there's the Director General, who is the kind of chief executive figure, who is somebody from mostly has come up from within the BBC, is the executive, often has been a senior journalist. The new Director General that has only been in place a few months is unusual. He's been at the BBC a long time, but he came from a marketing background. In fact, I think he worked for a confectionery company for a while, but he's the executive in charge, and the governance of the BBC keeps changing. But there's also a chairman, and that chairman is appointed by the government, and that chairman has just been appointed recently, and is a former banker who does have connections to the ruling Conservative Party.
And is there a term for that appointment?
Yeah, there is. That person serves, I think, as I say, it keeps changing. I think it's a 4 or 5 year term, that chairman, and they are part of a board of kind of non-executive directors. There's also there's a media regulator, which recently has become the sort of final court of appeal about BBC content decisions, called Ofcom. And now that's a regulator with a huge job, because it's also in charge. It's a bit like your FCC. It's in charge of spectrum. It's going to be in charge of online content, possibly, if a new law goes through. So that's got a very big job. But part of its job is taking complaints about BBC programs and adjudicating on them.
And for the BBC News, for the news broadcast, do I see the same news broadcast here in America as the broadcast that's shown in the UK or in Singapore?
No, because we have obviously a domestic program. We have 3 big news bulletins a day: one at 1, one at 6, one at 10, and those are obviously more focused on UK news. What you will see in the United States and in Singapore and around the world is a BBC World News Bulletin, which will be far more globally focused. Same reporters quite often, because the BBC has a network of global correspondents, but a completely different menu of items in there.
So how do you know when you do a story, a text story, how do you know who you're doing it for? Like, do they say, hey, this is for the domestic program, this is for world news? And do you, or do you just file the story and then someone decides where it's going to be distributed?
Well, my life's got much more complicated over the years. I've been in the BBC a very long time. I used to be just a TV reporter. I was originally mainly a business reporter, and I was just working for domestic news bulletins. And I would know exactly who I was working for. I would be working to an editor on a news bulletin who had very firm views about what the script should be and what the angle should be and so on. And that was pretty clear. Nowadays, there are far more people for me to serve, but I will still know who I'm doing a piece for. For instance, I might be doing a piece for our radio news bulletin, our home news bulletin in the evening. I might be doing something for our breakfast TV program. Breakfast television is nothing like as important in the UK as it is in America, but is still pretty important. And I would know what the audience was there. And I might be doing a live broadcast for our rolling news channel, or our 1 o'clock news bulletin, or our world TV bulletins. And I would know that the audiences were slightly different. But when it comes to technology stories, I think the tone, the content is going to be similar wherever it's shown. If I'm doing a story about Apple bringing out a new iPhone, or Amazon being under pressure over working practices, or Uber again losing a court battle, that will be told in much the same way wherever we are in the world. Because the sad truth from a British point of view is that most of the companies we're talking about are big American companies based in one small part of the world, and everybody knows about them. So you don't really have to explain who Apple is to somebody in Britain, different from somebody in Africa or California.
But you've been doing quite a bit of coverage around contact tracing apps in the UK. I imagine that coverage has been local to the UK, yes or no?
Yeah, it has. But I also, the other thing I do, which I've done for the last 6 years, is a weekly radio program on the BBC World Service, which is something we haven't spoken about, which is a global radio station, which has been around a very long time, which isn't commercial. It is funded directly now by the government. And we've covered contact tracing in that from all sorts of angles, because it's been a global story, the contact tracing story. And yes, I have done coverage in the UK aimed at the UK audience, because I've been talking about the UK app, or the England and Wales app as it is, because they've been separate ones. But I've also talked about the general trend to try and fight this coronavirus with this technology, which has been a fascinating technology story, because it's completely untested, and we're still not sure whether any of these apps really work.
I do want to get into the contact tracing, but just to follow up, you mentioned that it's a global radio show that you do.
Yeah.
What sort of backbone distributes global radio? Because How do you get terrestrial broadcast signals global?
Well, the BBC World Service has been around for a very long time. I'm trying to remember if it's dates before the Second World War or just after, but it is broadcast in the way that radio stations traditionally, I mean, it has been broadcast in that traditional, stick an aerial up and provide it that way. The same way as Voice of America, I suppose, has been broadcast. It has now gone, they're distributing far more via the internet, and there's a whole sort of podcasting operation. But it is something that is very familiar in a lot of countries, particularly in places. There's a huge audience, for instance, in Nigeria, countries that possibly have got old links with the UK. There are strong audiences, but all right from during the Cold War, for instance, we were doing our best to broadcast behind the Iron Curtain, and the signal was jammed. These days, we're trying to broadcast to China. Our TV channel has just been thoroughly, comprehensively banned by China. So it is a global operation with a pretty decent audience.
Now, Rory, in the pandemic, you've, I imagine, been following your stories from home, yes?
From right here.
So talk to us about how you go live. Talk to us about the apparatus behind, if you're going live, and is there live, or is it always pre-recorded? And talk to us about how you do that.
Well, it's been fascinating. I retreated into my attic last March, a year ago, really, towards the middle of March. And I've been into the office once since then, on one occasion, to do something in front of a green screen, which I couldn't do at home. And I do a whole number of things. So the radio program I do every week, we used to do live from a studio. So we don't do that anymore. And we probably won't do that even when we go back to the office, because the timings have changed, and that radio program now starts going out in the middle of the night. So we ain't going to be in a studio in the middle of the night. So what I do is arrange a lot of interviews in the exact way we're doing here, get people to record themselves locally. I've got a quality mic here. I record into an iPad and then beam it across here and send the recordings to my producer, who's across the other side of London, and he stitches the whole show together. We do a kind of an as live recording on a Thursday lunchtime of all the links, and then the producer stitches it all together. So that is all pre-recorded. I have got the means to go live again from here using a kind of a rather new system, a voice over IP system that I've been supplied with, a touchscreen device, again with this microphone. So that's radio. Interestingly, I've been using for many years an ISDN line to broadcast live from here, which is amazingly old technology, but was rock steady compared with internet broadcasting for many years. And this new device I've got is the first time I felt confident to use that rather than my ISDN line. So that's radio.
It'll be interesting to see, as we reach herd immunity, what type of things endure and which things we revert back to. I had read that after restaurants reopened prior to or following the Spanish flu pandemic, they never replaced the spittoons.
That's interesting.
So, I mean, what lasting changes will we see after everyone who wants to be vaccinated is vaccinated?
I think it's too early to. Can I just quickly say the other thing I do live is TV live shots, and I do it via this an older iPhone that I've got, where they Skype me, and I've got a microphone and earpiece I plug in, and I go live from here. And the shot looks amazingly good, I have to
And
say.
that's via iPhone. Is it iPhone 11?
It is iPhone 11. Yeah, yeah.
And do you have the 3 cameras on the back or just the
I,
2?
I've got the 3 cameras on the back, but I'm using the front camera
So you
to,
can see yourself.
yeah, so I can see what.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I've got no one to point it at me.
And so they would take that image and broadcast it live.
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
looks good. Looks good
it
on a
looks
big
good.
screen.
Yeah. I mean, we're all learning how to do this. I've got a very good internet connection here, kind of cable, 200 meg internet connection, so that helps. It's always kind of scary. I mean, when you think of what we've grown used to doing, being out in the field and having a huge satellite dish turn up and a team of engineers, this is years ago, and that's sort of boiled down until, you would at least be with, a cameraman and with probably a bunch of SIM cards in a machine called a Live View. And now this completely on one's own, it's kind of scary, but it sort of works. Now, is this a permanent change? We are accepting lower quality TV during this pandemic. You see endless terrible shots. I mean, I'm not going to boast about this shot. I've not lit this very well, but we see politicians being interviewed against the light, or holding the laptop like that, or whatever. So I think there will be, an urge to get back to the better professional standards you get from professional TV, but there will be a permanent change to, pushing the envelope in terms of what people can do from home. And every organization is going to think, what do we lose by not having people in the office, and what do we gain? And we do lose some things and we do gain some things.
Do you think there becomes less demand for commercial office space?
Well, that certainly would seem likely, wouldn't it? When you think the BBC's got a fantastic building that dates back to only about 2012. Well, it's on the site of its original broadcasting house. And the old bit is still there, but the new bit where the news operation is wraps around it. That has for the last year been about 1/8 occupied. Obviously, there are people that have to be there, but 7/8 of the people that fill it have worked from home. We've managed it pretty well. Would we, in future, build such a building to house quite so many people? There've got to be questions about that. And there are a lot of other organizations with much less need to have people on site. You think of, I think there's been discussions at the likes of Google about whether, you need to employ people in Silicon Valley, whether, they will be cheaper to employ in Texas, in the Midwest or whatever, dialing in each day. So there will be a big challenge to the real estate industry.
Let's talk for a minute about contact tracing, because I know it's something that you've done a fair amount of reporting about. I know there was a test of a contact tracing application, or mobile app rather, on the Isle of Wight last year, and then in London. And there was some experimentation with both centralized and decentralized databases. The idea being that if the data was decentralized and peer-to-peer, that would somehow not concern people, privacy, advocates about, Big Brother, worries about Big Brother not having too much information about them. Sort of what happened with contact tracing in the US, what happened with privacy concerns, and what happened with centralized versus decentralized data?
Well, I got involved in this story almost a year ago when somebody very senior from the tech industry in the UK, who'd been called in by government, called me and said, would I like to be involved? They seemed to think I was going to be an advisor. I said, I'd love to be involved as a journalist. I'd love to have people tell me stuff that's going on, which did then happen. And the ambitions back then were quite extraordinary. People had learned from Singapore. Singapore, it was that pioneered this, something called Trace Together, which was going to use Bluetooth to record proximity events between people. I've got an app, you've got an app. We happen to brush past each other or stand next to each other in the supermarket or on the bus or whatever for 10 minutes, and it records that contact has happened, that this phone has been linked to that phone. And then if one of those people then reports that they've been infected with a virus, anonymous messages can be sent to all those people who've had significant contacts with them. So that was the concept. And it has actually come to pass after a lot of aggravation in the UK. I've got the app on my phone. It's scanning right now. It has, just after Christmas, it did tell me to go into isolation for a week. So it does work. The debate was about the extent to which privacy should be built in. And the people behind the UK app, or the England and Wales app, because there were separate ones in Scotland and Northern Ireland, insisted that theirs was going to be private, but it was going to be, what privacy campaigners didn't like was that it was going to collect some data, anonymized data, in a central way. And meantime, Apple and Google came up with an API for contact tracing, which was decentralized. And there was a huge debate about which path to go down. And the British government kept going down the centralized path with the first version of the app, which was tried out on the Isle of Wight. And the problem with that was, whatever you think about privacy, without Apple's cooperation in particular, making these Bluetooth apps work is really difficult. You don't want them to drain the battery. You want them to record as accurately as you can. You want them to detect other phones as well as they can. And what they found was that without the cooperation of Apple, and Apple was not going to cooperate with a centralized app, they couldn't make it work. So they switched tack, and like a lot of countries around the world, went down the Apple and Google path. Now that also, to my mind, has some kind of worrying implications, because what you're saying is we're going to allow Apple and Google actually to determine our health policy. We can only do this with their permission. And who elected them? So there were arguments on both sides, but eventually an app that did work was released. There's been a lot of debate about how effective it's been. They've finally released some data showing how many people had been alerted, and it was quite a substantial number. But because of the anonymous nature of it, you don't know who's been alerted, and you don't know whether they've obeyed the message. Lots of people might get a message on here saying, stay home for a week, and they're going to go, nah. That's always been the problem from my point of view. This is a wonderful technological dream. There's a lot of utopianism about this. The smartphone can be our path out of this pandemic, but it depended on A, technology which was untested, using Bluetooth as a measure of proximity, and B, assumptions about human behavior, because the alternative obviously is manual contact tracing, where you get sick, people call you up and say, who have you seen? And then those contact tracers phone up individuals and say, hey, you better isolate. And believing that an alert on a phone is as powerful as a phone call is quite brave.
Up to now, most of the leading technology companies have been American. So, I mean, I think it's safe to say that the US is a technology leader. Yet, we've been resistant to using technology to stop the spread of the coronavirus, and we've actually had more deaths than any other developed nation. Why do you think that is?
Well, just to put it in context, we've had 120,000 deaths in this country now, which is, I think, in terms of the population, this is a country of 67 million people. You've had 500,000 deaths out of, is 300 million the population of the US? So I think in death rates, we're competing, we're pretty close, and we may well be ahead. So maybe you shouldn't beat yourselves up quite so much. I mean, obviously this happened, this pandemic, at a time of unique divisiveness in the United States. You'll be a better judge than me whether that it was the case or not. But you've not been able to have a constant policy across the United States in terms of masks, and I presume certainly not in terms of using technology. So I know that there have been a number of states that have adopted these contact tracing apps. There's very little evidence, I think, so far that they've been particularly effective. But then there's very little evidence around the world that they have been the silver bullet. And this all comes back to a debate about liberty, privacy, and surveillance. The countries that have done really well have been pretty ruthless about their citizens' behavior. Right at the early stages of this, I interviewed on my radio show a young journalist from Taiwan who'd been traveling in Europe and had come back as the pandemic was gripping the country. He had been stopped at the airport, sent into quarantine. They'd taken details of his phone. And one day he was sitting at home and his battery went flat on his phone. And 45 minutes later, the police were knocking on his door to check that he hadn't left home because they were monitoring his phone. And once his phone disappeared from the map, they thought he might be on the move. So that level of surveillance, we wouldn't accept. Another example, South Korea, which has done pretty well in controlling things, had a whole system of using CCTV, credit card transactions, and all sorts of other data sources to basically track people and make sure that any case could be contact traced pretty efficiently. So that was a partly technological method, but it depended on consumer acceptance, public acceptance of methods that certainly in the United States and probably in Britain too would be unacceptable to most people.
Hey, you mentioned closed circuit television. In the US, many of the closed circuit television systems that are in place use an operating system that's free called Hikvision. And Hikvision is a Chinese company.
Yeah.
And so you look at that and you have to wonder whether or not they have access to all those cameras.
Yeah. Well, of course, that brings us on to a whole new area of debate about what we feel about Chinese technology. And certainly in this country, partly under pressure from your administration, we've turned cold on one of our biggest suppliers of technology, Huawei. And Hikvision has been mentioned too, because I think there was some suggestion that they controlled the CCTV system around our parliament in Westminster.
Interesting. Let's talk just for a minute about sort of how you decide what to cover. How do you use technology to cover the news yourself? What monitoring services or are you using? Do you look at social media? What's trending? How do you sort of keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in tech?
I'm beginning to feel that I'm slower than some of my colleagues in doing this. I work very closely with our online team, and every morning we have two Zooms, one at 8:30 and one at 9:30, at which my colleague, who's our sort of desk editor, goes through, has already scrubbed every kind of source. So yeah, we keep a very close eye on social media. We use a whole bunch of tools to monitor stories. I was a pretty early adopter of Twitter. And in the early days, it was great for one's reputation internally, because you saw stuff there long before any of your colleagues. I remember one occasion back in something like 2007, 2008, I called into our news desk and said there'd been an earthquake, quite a serious earthquake in some Latin American country. And they said, no, there hasn't. We'd have heard by now. And I had seen it on Twitter, which nobody knew anything about at that stage. So Twitter became kind of bound into my journalism for quite some years. It still is. I still, if I'm looking for case studies or trying to get to people, Twitter's often my first port of call. But now that's something that everybody does, so it doesn't really give you much of an edge. And the slightly worrying thing is, I've been around an awful long time. There used to be a great confidence 30, 40 years ago in what was a story. Your editor would tell you, that's not a story. My Auntie Jenny in Heckmondwike is not interested in that. Or that's a story. That'll have them talking in the pubs. So these were old journalists who thought they knew what the news was. And now you've got, well, you may say that's not interesting to your Aunt Jenny, but look at what's on the most read list, or look what people are clicking on. There's an instant kind of feedback from the audience. You change a headline on an online story, you can immediately see, yeah, there are more people in that story than there were before. And that has kind of, in some ways, sapped the confidence of some editors and perhaps made some of them a bit too eager to chase, for instance, a certain demographic. We're all concerned here, as I'm sure you are, about whether we're serving, under 35-year-old audiences, difficult to reach audiences, whether we're seeing everybody.
We are living through a time of unprecedented migration from analog to digital business practices, drawing on my experience leading online marketing programs for Toyota, UCLA, the Marine Corps, U.S. Department of State, LA Opera, and others. I just finished a book that walks you step by step through the process of pivoting to digital marketing. It's called The Digital Pivot: Secrets of Online Marketing, and it's an all-in-one practical playbook that covers everything you need to know about leveraging owned, shared, and earned media to compete online. I'm releasing the book this spring, and for the first few days, you'll be able to get the book for free. I'll send you a free ebook if you sign up at ericschwartzman.com/author. Rory, what news media outlets do you consume? And who are your favorite writers?
Oh, wow. I consume an awful lot. I consume, we get 2 newspapers delivered to my house. My wife is an economist, so she consumes a vast amount of information about economics. We get the Financial Times is probably my favorite publication, and they've got all sorts of great writers there. One of my young colleagues who I kind of was a mentor to is now one of the FT's people in Silicon Valley. He specializes in Amazon, called Dave Lee. I will always look out for his stories. I'll look out for Kara Swisher from the New York Times. But generally, I will just be consuming as much as I can, whatever comes my way. Long reads in Wired, the MIT Technology Review. The real challenge is information overload, being able to actually sit back and properly absorb something rather than just skimming in the desperate hop from one link to another.
Now, you mentioned that your desk editor sort of goes through the pitches and what's going on and whittles them down for your 8:30 meeting. Are you receiving pitches from PR people directly?
Unbelievable numbers of pitches. Yeah, all the time. And the worst ones are the ones which say, "Did you read my previous pitch?" every now and then I feel guilty because I don't reply to most of the pitches I get. But then when I try and clear my inbox at the end of the week, I realize that if I replied, I would literally do nothing else. The sheer volume of PR material, and a lot of it really, really badly targeted, is becoming almost impossible to cope with. I mean, just as an example, I get a lot of places emailing me saying, we'd like to place an article, an authored piece with you. The BBC just doesn't do authored pieces. You're wasting your time. So it's kind of PR is spam, a lot of it. So what you tend to develop relationships with 2 or 3 really good PR people who you will trust, who will only approach you with something that you know might make the effort of turning into television or an online piece.
And who are those PR people?
Well, I'm not going to name them, but I mean, generally I find that I always prefer to deal with in-house people. There's a huge range of agencies, from very good ones to, unfortunately, the spam merchants. But there are 2 or 3 people who, if they come to me, I will seriously listen to. I mean, there are obviously some where one is a supplicant. If you're calling Apple, you know what the answer is going to be. They will do nothing for you, but you will still call them. So if they ever came to offer you something, you would sit up and listen, but they never do. Somebody at another company, I won't name, but is a great PR guy who came to me more than 10 years ago and said the BBC main news bulletin should do a piece about cloud computing, this thing called cloud computing, which has never been explained to the public. And we ended up flying to the West Coast and filming in a giant data center and doing a whole bunch of interviews about this thing called cloud computing and explaining it to the world. And about 5 years after that, he said, you know what you should be explaining to people? Quantum computing. And my head fell into my hands, because trying to explain quantum computing in 2.5 minutes, which is what you might get for a TV news bulletin, is a nightmare. And we did do it. And it was then featured, this piece, there's a program called Gogglebox, which is a kind of funny program where viewers are watching television and are commenting on it. And they express themselves in very colorful language, basically saying WTF, when I tried to explain quantum computing to them. And when I told the PR guy who'd flown in people from the West Coast to take part in this piece, that this piece had featured on Gogglebox, he groaned and then said, how am I going to explain that to the West Coast?
And he called you or he emailed you?
He'll do both. He will usually call me, this guy, and he won't call often. He'll only call, a couple of times a year. And sometimes I know he's been told by his superiors that he's got to call me and sell me something, and I will know that his heart isn't in it, because he rightly thinks it's not going to fly for me.
Is he agency or client side?
He's client side now. He used to be agency, but he's client side.
Outside of big tech and celebrities, what makes a tech story newsworthy?
Golly, that is like the original question. That is like, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of news? Something that's significant, and something that will also reach out to a wider section of the audience than complete specialists. I mean, there are different stories for different audiences. And one can say that is a story that will work online on our tech index, where people come who've, got a pretty good grounding in technology, but that will not make for the nightly news. And then that is a story that will mean something for the nightly news. And it's often a gamble, isn't it? First, the biggest gamble is, can you convince the editor of the nightly news to spend some money and put that story out, which I did with the quantum computing, but with other things not. I want to tell you a quick story about the launch of the iPhone, which I covered. So I got sent to CES, which is the big annual gadget fest, for the first time back in 2007. The BBC decided to do it big. And I said, we need to break away from CES because there's this other show happening in San Francisco, Macworld, and the rumor is there's going to be something big. And we flew over for one day, having already spent a lot of money going to Las Vegas. We flew to San Francisco and saw Steve Jobs unveil the iPhone. And as I was running back to the hotel to try and feed the pictures, got a call from London saying, for the first time, from a desk editor saying, we're really excited about this. You've got to get your hands on the phone. And I said, that's impossible. But then I remembered had been offered an interview, which I hadn't taken up, with Phil Schiller, Steve Jobs' marketing guy, rushed back, borrowed his phone very briefly, did a quick interview and did a thing with the phone. But then the next weekend I was on a BBC complaints program where viewers had written in saying that wasn't a story. That was just a product plug, a promotional plug for a new product. And I stuck my neck out and said, well, I think that was a story. I think that history will show that was an important moment. And think back, if the BBC had been around when the Model T Ford had come out, and we'd covered that, would that have just been a plug, or would that have been a story worth telling? And people were skeptical, but I think, that was January, I think it was the 7th, 2007. That was a moment in history. When you think of what the smartphone revolution, which effectively began that day, what that has wrought, that was an incredibly important moment.
I want to talk to you about a phishing scam, but just to wrap up this discussion on media relations, give me a sense, like, how many PR pitches are we talking a day that you're getting?
Well, I counted. I'm getting about 300 emails a day. That doesn't mean they're all PR pitches. A lot of them are kind of newsletters, which I should never have signed up to. But I'm probably getting a dozen. Dear Rory, we think you should cover this story. And day.
Of those dozen, how many are just completely, never going to happen? And how many are actually, legitimate pitches of something newsworthy?
I'd say 1 or 2 out of a dozen.
And do you read them all?
I've actually replied to one. I just had an email, a message on Twitter, a DM. Sometimes they come from DMs on Twitter these days,
right,
which is quite a good way of getting to me, although that is beginning to get a bit spammy too. This woman said, we're working in Nigeria. We're using virtual reality to combat corruption, putting public officials through some virtual reality experience where they're offered a bribe. And I said, that sounds like a possible. We might be interested in that. So that is quite unusual. And the trouble is, as one gets older and tireder and more cynical, well, there's a real danger that you miss the really good thing. I mean, of course, the best stories are the ones that companies don't want you to know. I mean, one of the best stories I ever had came from an email from a guy at a company who said, this company's technology doesn't work and it's all a lie. And it turned into a really good story about a little company which claimed to be using artificial intelligence to translate people's voicemails into text, but was in fact using hundreds of call centers around the world to listen in and type them up, which was obviously unsustainable and also very insecure.
I know you do quite a bit about cybersecurity, so I want to tell you an interesting story, and I want to tell my listeners this story too. So, my wife got approached by a recruiter on LinkedIn from a big company called InvestCorp. InvestCorp is a global investment company that owns real estate and businesses all over the world. They're a legitimate company. with significant, billions of dollars under management. And they said to her, hey, we liked your background, and we have a remote accounts payable job, and we wonder if you might be interested in it. And she checked them out. They looked legit. She showed them to me. They looked legit. So she responded saying, yeah, I would consider it. And then she got another message on LinkedIn from the recruiter saying, we use this product called Vervo, which is a skills testing application. Vervo is VERVOE, and they're based in Australia. And, would you take a skills test so we can, verify that you have the skill to do the job? So she says, okay. And she goes on to Vervo, which is also a legitimate company with real clients. And she signs up there and she takes an AP accounting test. It's a 90-minute test. And, she gets a score. And the next day she gets an offer letter where it says, we would offer you 20 hours a week and a bonus thing. And it looks very legitimate. And she says, and it says, we use a system called Flock, which is like a competitor to Slack. And, sign up on Flock and we can, meet there. So she goes on Flock, and there's a bunch of people on Flock, like 8 or 9 people who are also, onboarding. And she's able to chat with those people about where they're from. One person says she's from New Hampshire. She's just starting up. And they're all sort of talking about, getting started. And they get instructions for onboarding. And then she gets, different forms to fill out so that she can receive her payment. And one of them is an IRS form that's been pre-filled out with all the InvestCorp information. So it looks completely legit. And she shows it to me. She says, can I do this? I say, looks totally legitimate to me. So she signs up for it. And they say, okay, we'll get you started in 48 hours. So, 24, 36 hours later, she looks at me, she says, I think I've been scammed. I say, why do you think that? She said, I don't know. I just have a feeling. I said, no way. You're freaking out. It's nothing. It's completely fine. She calls the head of HR for InvestCorp and leaves a frantic message, and another one for the head of legal affairs at InvestCorp and leaves a message. And she tells me, I'm like, oh, why did you do that? That was ridiculous. You never should have done that. Everything's fine. You're going to be starting soon. Sure enough, she gets a call back from the head attorney from InvestCorp and the head of HR at InvestCorp saying, no, we're not hiring for any of those positions. This is a scam. Next, they put a notice up on their homepage saying, click here for more information about the scam. I do a search on Google and I find that Atlantic Media has been scammed as well. And they're running on their homepage a whole account of this, elaborate scheme. I mean, can you imagine? And the funny thing is, pardon me?
What were they trying to get? Where did they get her bank details?
They never got her bank details. They got her social security number. They got her driver's license information. And at that point, she realized, oh my God, there's something wrong here. And then she shut it down, froze her credit, alerted the authorities about the driver's license, got a new driver's license. So, no harm, no foul, other than, a couple of 100 hours of her life wasted having to deal with it. But the interesting thing is this, okay? It's a 20-hour gig for a part-time accounts payable person. What is the amount of work that had to go into getting her information is so elaborate. There was so much time and energy, even stooges in Flock, for her to be able to chat with, to be able to verify that, in fact, this is legit. I mean, it's got to be the Russians. Who the hell else could pull this off?
And we're sure that the stooges in Flock weren't other victims, but they were stooges.
Well, I mean, we're not. I mean, my son thinks that they were AI. I think it'd be cheaper to just get stooges, wouldn't it? And maybe one or two were other people. Who knows? We don't know.
Wow.
Terry Kellman, who's on the line with us, says he thinks it's Nigeria and China. But let me tell you something. I don't think I looked at the communications carefully. I looked at how this thing was structured. I mean, these people had resources. They spent a lot of time in it, and it was very well done. I mean, I produced a couple of online courses about cybersecurity, and I couldn't see through it. I was duped by it. Unbelievably sophisticated.
It is, and it kind of all more ironic. I keep getting the worst phishing gang ever contacting me saying BBC HR department, and they put the BBC logo wrong, capital B, small c, HR department. You have been offered a bonus for your good work. Click on this Google document. And this makes all my colleagues laugh hysterically because the BBC ain't been paying any bonuses for a long time. So it's...
Well, we're a long way from the Nigerian prince who needs you to lend him $100 so he can reclaim his rightful throne. I mean, this was like, and it seems like as we come out of the pandemic, people wanting work, it seems like this employment channel could be a really fruitful way to go, because obviously if you believe you're getting a job, you have to provide your contact information.
This sounds like you'd think this would work if it was spear phishing. You know, they were going for, which we know they do, these kind of clever scams where people end up thinking they're being told by their chief executive to make some money transfer. A company which defends against that showed me how easy I would be to fool one day by sending me an email from my producer with a link in it to click, and of course they just spoofed his email. But that does sound a really sophisticated scam. But one's got to ask, what was the return on capital invested?
Well, in this case, we got lucky. You know, she somehow had a premonition and, you know, turned it all off before. But it was, I mean, I'm a professional in this community, and if it was up to me, we'd have been duped.
Yeah.
Now, Rory, the latest Trust Barometer report from Edelman says we're living through a pandemic and an infodemic at the same time. Trust in news media and elected officials is at an all-time low, and people don't know where to turn for accurate news and information anymore. What needs to happen to fix the situation?
Well, that is a very big question. First of all, it's important not to exaggerate that lack of trust. Well, certainly in the UK, I know far more about the trust levels here. Trust in the BBC has gone down a little, but our coverage, according to surveys just like that, is still trusted way more than newspapers, certainly way more than tabloid newspapers, and a hell of a lot more than Facebook, the news accessed on Facebook. So I think we've got to be brave about believing in our journalism and showing the way our journalism works and combating this wave of disinformation. I think, you know, I've just read a book by the founder of an organization called Bellingcat, which is an open source journalism organization, which has done amazing things in tracking down, for instance, the poisoners of Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, and the Russian agents who came to Salisbury in England a couple of years ago and tried to commit murder here and accidentally, by chance, killed a British citizen. And this organization, Bellingcat, uses publicly available data to wage this information war. They've shown, for instance, convincingly that the Syrians did use chemical weapons in their war there, but they are in a huge battle with what Elliot Higgins in this book calls the counterfactual community, those people who are determined to spread lies and deceit. And I think it's important that we all, as journalists, stand up for the truth and call out lies when we see them, and don't be frightened of sticking by our journalism and not just saying, well, some people say this, some people say that, but trusting the truth.
According to All Sides Media, which does a multi-partisan scientific analysis of media bias, the BBC is considered to be among the unbiased news media outlets, along with news from NPR, the Associated Press, and Reuters. What systems are in place to maintain the Biebs' neutral point of view?
Well, it is built into our DNA. And in fact, our new Director General, Tim Davie, has come in and made this a big feature, that impartiality is at the core of what we do. And as I say, it's called due impartiality. We are not told that, for instance, we must be impartial about climate change. There was a big row a few years ago about a BBC program which gave equal prominence to a climate scientist and a climate change denier. We no longer do that. We say the science on climate change is pretty settled, and we will be biased towards the belief that climate change is real, for instance. But we are very, very focused as BBC journalists on striving to be impartial. It is built into our DNA, as I said. In fact, we're about to go on a whole series of courses highlighting this, trying to bolster our impartiality. It doesn't mean that we're not a battleground from both sides. We, during the whole thorny issue of Brexit, we were accused by the people favouring Brexit of being massively biased against them, and by the people opposing Brexit of being massively biased against them. And in these very, divided times, it gets more difficult, because people say they want unbiased news, but actually quite often what they want is news that reflects their point of view and not others.
Tell us about this book you have coming out.
Yeah, I'm writing a book called Always On, Hope and Fear in the Social Smartphone Era. And it's basically an account of, I talked earlier about the birth of the iPhone. It's an account of the years since 2007 and the way I've experienced them. And that arc that we had. This has been an era where technology has, for the first time, become really personal. I grew up at the times of the moon landings, nuclear power. Technology was big, exciting, but inaccessible. You never thought you would go to the moon or own a computer. And now we're all walking around with incredibly powerful computers in our pockets. And I try, in the first half of the book, to capture the extraordinary changes and the excitement of that era, and the way these phones, coupled with the development of social media, really transformed every aspect of our lives. And then things take a downward turn as I consider the downsides, the obsessiveness of these devices, what we've seen in terms of the damaging effects on our democracy of social media, and in particular of Facebook, and try and sort of weigh up where we've got to on that. And the final section of the book is written during the pandemic, where all the pluses and minuses come to the fore. I thought at the beginning, a year ago, I wrote a piece about what would have happened if this pandemic had happened in 2005, just before the smartphone era, and how much more difficult it would have been for us to cope. And that's been the good side, the fact that we are doing this here, which would not have been possible in 2005. And the bad side has been that infodemic that has spread around the world of phony news about COVID, links to 5G, that kind of area.
Rory Cellan-Jones, tech correspondent from the BBC. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And if you're listening and you'd like to support the podcast, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts.